Billionaire invited his black homeless ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her. Then her arrival shocked everyone. "Stop the wedding." The homeless woman's voice echoed through the Worthington estate as security guards rushed toward her. But when billionaire Jonathan Worthington saw his ex-wife's face, he knew his carefully planned humiliation had just become his worst nightmare. In 60 seconds, she would speak 3 words that would cost him everything. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Once again, you're welcome to Mr. Paul's Stories, where we weave our dreams and hearts together through the magic of stories. Now, let's begin today's story. The September rain hammered the cardboard beneath Diane Washington's feet, turning her makeshift shelter behind the Chase Bank on 5th Avenue into a soggy mess. At 42, she had the kind of beauty that homelessness couldn't quite erase. High cheekbones that caught what little light filtered through the Manhattan alley, and eyes that still held flickers of the fire that once commanded boardrooms across Wall Street. She clutched the golden envelope that had somehow found her here, among the forgotten souls of New York City. The return address made her stomach lurch: Worthington Estate, Beverly Hills, California. Jonathan's family compound. The same place where she'd once planned her own wedding, back when love felt possible and dreams seemed within reach. Her fingers, cracked from cold and malnutrition, carefully opened the expensive cardstock. The calligraphy was perfect, each letter formed with a precision that only money could buy. Mr. Jonathan Blake Worthington III cordially invites Ms. Diane Washington to witness his marriage to Miss Victoria Hamilton at the Worthington Estate. Your presence would make this joyous occasion complete. Diane's laugh came out as a bitter rasp. Joyous occasion. She knew Jonathan better than that. This wasn't kindness. This was calculated cruelty. He wanted her there to see what she'd lost, to witness the life he was building without her, to publicly display her fall from grace like a trophy of his victory. What would you do if your ex invited you to their wedding while you were at your lowest point? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you go, or would you stay away? The memory hit her like a physical blow. Their last fight, 3 years ago in their penthouse overlooking Central Park. She discovered the embezzlement at his company. Funds meant for affordable housing projects mysteriously redirected to offshore accounts. When she threatened to go to the authorities, he'd smiled that cold smile she'd learned to fear. Who do you think they'll believe, Diane? The successful white billionaire, or his angry black wife who's been drinking too much lately? The drinking had been her way of coping with the growing distance between them, the way he'd begun looking at her like she was an acquisition that had depreciated in value. But he'd weaponized her pain, used it to destroy her credibility before she could destroy him. Within a month, she'd found herself not only divorced but facing fraud charges, charges that mysteriously appeared right after she'd tried to expose him. Her assets frozen, her reputation ruined, her legal team somehow compromised. Jonathan had left her with nothing. Not even her dignity. Now, 1,500 miles away in Beverly Hills, Jonathan was preparing for the wedding of the century. She'd seen the coverage in the discarded newspapers she sometimes found, society pages gushing over his engagement to Victoria Hamilton, daughter of a tech mogul, a woman whose blonde perfection and pedigree made her everything Diane had never been in Jonathan's eyes. The rain intensified, and Diane pressed herself deeper into the doorway. Her clothes, a torn coat she'd found at the Salvation Army on the Lower East Side and jeans with holes that weren't fashionable, clung to her thin frame. When had she become so small? She used to fill rooms with her presence, command respect with a single look. Now she was invisible, just another casualty of a system designed to crush people like her. But something about the invitation felt different. Too deliberate. Too risky. Jonathan was many things. Cruel, calculating, heartless. But he wasn't stupid. Inviting her to his wedding wasn't just about humiliation. There was something else, some deeper game he was playing. Her phone, a cracked Android she'd bought with the last of her savings, buzzed with a text from an unknown California number. The world needs to see who you really are. Both of you. Be there. A friend. Diane stared at the message until the screen went dark. Who could possibly know she'd received the invitation? Who cared enough about ancient history to reach out? The wind picked up, carrying with it the sounds of the city that had once embraced her and now seemed determined to erase her. Yellow cabs honked their way down Fifth Avenue, their passengers warm and dry and purposeful. Street vendors called out in languages that reminded her of the diversity she'd once celebrated in her marketing campaigns for Jonathan's company. The smell of food trucks made her stomach cramp with hunger. She thought of Victoria Hamilton, probably trying on her designer wedding dress right now in some Beverly Hills boutique, surrounded by friends and family who would never know what it felt like to choose between pride and survival. Victoria, who would walk down an aisle scattered with rose petals that cost more than most people made in a month, to marry a man who had systematically destroyed the woman who'd loved him first. The invitation grew soggy in her hands, the gold embossing starting to smear. She should throw it away. She should forget Jonathan Worthington ever existed. She should focus on the daily business of staying alive, of finding food and warmth and maybe, eventually, a way back to something resembling a life. But as she sat there in the rain, surrounded by the debris of her former existence, Diane felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: curiosity. What was Jonathan really up to? What did he hope to accomplish by parading her brokenness in front of Beverly Hills society? And more importantly, what did she have left to lose? The next morning brought no relief from the rain, but it did bring clarity. Diane sat in the small shelter on West 14th Street, the invitation spread before her on the scratched metal table. Around her, other displaced souls moved through their morning routines, some heading out to day labor jobs, others simply trying to stay warm until the libraries opened. She'd been awake all night, the mysterious text message replaying in her mind, "The world needs to see who you really are. Both of you." Margaret, an older woman who'd been on the streets longer than anyone, slid onto the bench across from her. Her weathered face held the kind of wisdom that came from surviving what shouldn't be survivable. "That's some fancy paper you got there, honey," Margaret said, nodding toward the invitation. "Good news or bad news?" "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore," Diane replied, her voice hoarse from the cold night. "My ex-husband wants me at his wedding." Margaret's laugh was surprisingly warm. "Lord have mercy. That's either the cruelest thing I ever heard, or what? Or he's more afraid of you than you think." The words hit Diane like a revelation. In all her pain and self-pity, she hadn't considered that angle. Jonathan was methodical, calculating. He never did anything without multiple layers of purpose. If he wanted her at his wedding, it wasn't just about humiliation. There was something else. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, this time with a New York area code. "Flight leaves LaGuardia at 3 p.m. Confirmation number, HKJ 7892. First class. Your choice." Diane's hands shook as she stared at the message. Someone had booked her a flight to Los Angeles. First class. The ticket alone would cost more than she'd seen in 3 years. "Margaret," she whispered, showing her the phone. "What do you make of this?" Margaret squinted at the screen, then looked up with sharp eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by anything. "Honey, that's either your guardian angel or someone who needs you in California real bad. Question is, what you gonna do about it?" The memory flooded back without warning, their honeymoon in Napa Valley, when Jonathan had whispered promises about changing the world together. She'd believed in him then, believed in them. They were going to build affordable housing, create opportunities for underprivileged communities, use his family's wealth for good. I loved him, she said quietly, more to herself than to Margaret. I really believed we could make a difference. Love don't die easy, Margaret replied. But sometimes it changes shape. Sometimes it becomes something stronger, like the need to set things right. Diane thought about Victoria Hamilton, the young woman about to marry a monster. Did she know what kind of man Jonathan really was? Did she know about the forged documents, the stolen funds, the way he'd systematically destroyed anyone who threatened to expose him? Have you ever had to choose between staying safe and doing what's right? What would you risk to expose the truth? Share your thoughts below. The shelter's Wi-Fi was weak, but Diane managed to pull up news articles about Jonathan's engagement. The photos showed him looking distinguished and happy, Victoria radiant in designer gowns at charity galas. But Diane had learned to read between the lines of Jonathan's public image. There, in a Business Journal article from 6 months ago, Worthington Development was facing federal investigation for irregularities in government housing contracts. The same contracts Diane had been working on when she discovered the embezzlement. Someone was still digging, still asking questions. Her reflection stared back at her from the black phone screen. Hollow cheeks, tired eyes, hair that hadn't seen a proper salon in years. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been systematically destroyed and abandoned. But beneath the surface damage, something else flickered. The spark that had once made her a formidable businesswoman, the intelligence that had earned her a Harvard MBA, the strength that had carried her through childhood in Detroit's roughest neighborhoods, all of it was still there, buried but not broken. Another memory, her grandmother's voice, strong and unwavering, "Baby girl, sometimes you gotta walk through hell to prove you can't be burned." Diane closed her eyes and made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would go to Beverly Hills. Not as the broken victim Jonathan expected, but as something he'd never seen coming. She would walk into his perfect wedding and let the truth speak for itself. But first, she needed to make a call. The number was still in her phone, buried in contacts she'd never deleted. FBI agent Sarah Chun, the woman who'd tried to help her 3 years ago, who'd believed her story even when the evidence seemed stacked against her. The call connected on the second ring. Agent Chun speaking. "Sarah, it's Diane Washington." A pause. "Diane? My God, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for months. The investigation into Worthington Development, we found something. We found everything." Diane's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "The offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the witness intimidation, we can prove all of it. Jonathan Worthington is going down, Diane. And we need your testimony to make it stick." The shelter around her seemed to fade away. "When? We were planning to arrest him next week, but if you're willing to help us, where are you right now?" Diane looked at the golden invitation, at the mysterious flight confirmation, at the faces of the people around her who'd shown her more kindness in 3 years than her ex-husband had in their entire marriage. "I'm about to board a plane to his wedding." Agent Chun was quiet for a long moment. "Diane, that's incredibly dangerous. If he suspects..." "He won't suspect anything. He thinks I'm broken. He thinks I'm nothing." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But he's wrong. What do you need from me?" Diane smiled for the first time in months. "Just be ready to make your arrest. I have a feeling Jonathan's wedding is going to be very memorable." After she hung up, Margaret was watching her with knowing eyes. "You look different, honey. Like you just remembered something important." Diane stood, the invitation clutched in her hand. "I remembered who I used to be. And who I still am underneath all of this." The rain had stopped. Through the shelter's windows, she could see patches of blue sky breaking through the gray clouds over Manhattan. In 6 hours, she would be in Los Angeles. In 18 hours, she would be walking into Jonathan Worthington's wedding. But she wouldn't be walking in as the victim he expected. She would be walking in as the woman who was about to change everything. The Greyhound bus from New York's Port Authority to Los Angeles took 3 days, and Diane spent every mile building walls around her heart. She'd used the last $47 from the coffee can hidden in her alley, emergency money she'd been saving for winter boots, to buy the ticket. Now she sat in the back row, watching America blur past through a cracked window, trying to convince herself this wasn't the biggest mistake of her life. The other passengers gave her space. It wasn't just her appearance, the second-hand clothes that didn't quite fit, the canvas bag with a broken zipper that held everything she owned. It was the energy she radiated. Raw, wounded, dangerous in the way that only the truly desperate could be. This is insane, she told herself as the bus pulled into a rest stop outside of Chicago. You're walking into a trap. But something about that mysterious text message wouldn't let her rest. Someone knew. Someone cared enough to reach out. And after 3 years of being invisible, the possibility of being seen, really seen, was worth almost any risk. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away in Beverly Hills, Jonathan Worthington III stood in his walk-in closet, adjusting his Italian silk tie in a mirror that cost more than most people's cars. The Worthington estate buzzed with pre-wedding activity, florists arranging white orchids flown in from Thailand, caterers preparing a 7-course meal that would feed 200 of California's most influential people, and a string quartet from the Los Angeles Philharmonic rehearsing in the garden. She won't come, he muttered to his reflection, but his hands shook slightly as he knotted the tie. He'd sent that invitation on impulse, a moment of cruel inspiration after seeing her name in a private investigator's report about the homeless population near his old Manhattan office building. The idea of Diane Washington, once the most poised woman in any room, showing up in rags to his wedding had seemed like perfect poetry. But now, with hours until the ceremony, doubt crept in. What if she actually showed up? What if she somehow found a way to disrupt his perfect day? Jonathan. Victoria Hamilton appeared in the doorway, radiant in her silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly styled even for the pre-ceremony chaos. At 28, she had the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genes, better nutrition, and a lifetime of never wanting for anything. The photographer wants to do some shots of us together before I put on the dress. He forced a smile and pulled her close, breathing in her expensive perfume. Victoria was everything he'd told himself he wanted: young, blonde, socially connected, and most importantly, utterly uncomplicated. She didn't question his business practices, didn't challenge his decisions, didn't look at him with those knowing eyes that had always made Diane so dangerous. "You seem nervous," Victoria observed, adjusting his tie with manicured fingers. "It's adorable. I've never seen you anything but completely confident." "Because you've never really seen me," he thought, but kissed her forehead instead. "Just want everything to be perfect for you." The truth was more complex. Victoria represented vindication, proof that he'd upgraded, that divorcing Diane had been the right choice. But vindication only worked if there was an audience who remembered what he'd left behind. Hence the invitation. His phone buzzed, a text from his head of security. "No sign of the individual you asked us to watch for. Probably didn't have the means to travel. You can relax." Jonathan should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt oddly disappointed. Part of him, the part he'd never admit to anyone, almost wanted Diane to show up. Wanted to see what 3 years had done to her. Wanted to know if she still had that fire in her eyes, even banked low and nearly extinguished. Back on the bus, now crossing into Nevada, Diane stared out at the desert landscape and remembered their first fight about money. It had been early in their marriage, when she discovered he'd been claiming tax deductions for charitable donations he'd never actually made. "It's not illegal," he'd said, that same dismissive tone he'd use later when she'd confront him about bigger crimes. "It's creative accounting. It's lying, Jonathan. We have more money than we could spend in 3 lifetimes. Why risk your integrity for a few thousand in tax savings? You wouldn't understand. You didn't grow up in my world." That phrase, "you didn't grow up in my world," had become his weapon of choice. Every time she'd questioned his business ethics, every time she'd pushed back against his increasingly callous treatment of employees, every time she tried to hold him accountable, he'd remind her that she was an outsider. That despite her MBA from Wharton, despite her successful marketing career, despite the fact that she'd helped build his company's brand from nothing, she would never truly belong in his world. The worst part was that she'd started to believe him. The bus pulled into a rest stop outside Las Vegas, and Diane stepped out to stretch her legs. The desert air was dry and clean, so different from the humid heaviness of New York in September. A group of tourists from the bus gathered around slot machines just inside the travel center, feeding quarters into machines with desperate hope. "We're all gambling," she thought, watching an elderly woman pull the lever with arthritic fingers. "They're gambling on luck. I'm gambling on, what? Justice? Revenge? The chance to look Jonathan in the eye one more time?" Her phone, which had been dead for the last 6 hours, suddenly showed a bar of signal. 3 new messages appeared. "Unknown number, you're closer than you think. Don't lose faith." "Unknown number, he's terrified you'll actually show up. Good." "Unknown number, tomorrow, 3 p.m. The garden ceremony. Be ready for anything." Diane's heart hammered against her ribs. Whoever was sending these messages had inside information about the wedding. Someone in Jonathan's circle was helping her, but why? And what did they mean by be ready for anything? She thought about turning around, about getting on the next bus back to New York and forgetting this whole insane journey. She had no money for a hotel, no appropriate clothes for a Beverly Hills wedding, and no plan beyond simply showing up. What was she hoping to accomplish? What could possibly justify spending her last dollars on this fool's errand? But as she stood there in the fluorescent glare of the travel center, watching desperate people chase impossible dreams, Diane realized something had changed during these 3 days of travel. The walls she'd built around her heart weren't just to keep out pain, they were also keeping out possibility. For 3 years, she'd survived by making herself small, invisible, unthreatening. She'd accepted Jonathan's version of events, internalized his narrative that she was damaged goods, a cautionary tale about what happened when people reached above their station. But sitting on that bus, watching the country roll past, she'd remembered who she used to be. Before Jonathan, before the marriage, before the fall, she'd been Diane Washington, the girl from Detroit who'd earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, who'd built marketing campaigns that changed how America saw luxury brands, who'd never backed down from a fight when the cause was right. Maybe she couldn't get her old life back. Maybe she'd never again live in a penthouse or command a 6-figure salary. But she could stop running from who she used to be. The bus driver called for everyone to board. Diane took one last look at the slot machine players, still pulling levers with doomed optimism, and made her choice. She wasn't going to Jonathan's wedding to beg or to be humiliated. She was going because someone who knew more than they were letting on, wanted her there. And after 3 years of being nobody, the chance to matter again, even for a moment, was worth any risk. As the bus pulled away from Las Vegas and headed toward California, Diane Washington began preparing for war. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Worthington estate as Diane found herself cornered in the marble-floored powder room adjacent to the main ballroom. Her reflection in the gold-framed mirror told the story of 3 years on the streets, hollow cheeks, graying temples, clothes that hung like surrender flags on her diminished frame. But her eyes still burned with the intelligence that had once built marketing empires. A soft knock interrupted her moment of reckoning. "Mrs. Worthington?" The voice was young, uncertain. "May I come in?" Diane almost corrected the name. She hadn't been Mrs. Worthington for 3 years, but something in the tone made her pause. "It's open." A young woman entered, maybe 25, with kind eyes and designer clothes that screamed old money. She carried a small clutch purse and moved with the nervous energy of someone harboring secrets. "I'm Emily Patterson, Victoria's cousin." The woman extended her hand, then seemed to think better of it when she noticed Diane's condition. I was the one who sent you the text message." The words hit Diane like ice water. "You? But how did you even know about the invitation?" Emily's hands trembled as she opened her clutch, pulling out what looked like legal documents. "Because I work at Morrison & Associates, the law firm that handled your case." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The firm that threw your case on purpose." Diane's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the marble countertop, her knuckles going white. "What are you talking about?" "Jonathan paid my boss $2 million to ensure you lost everything." Emily's words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for years. "I was just a paralegal then, but I saw the documents. The real evidence that would have cleared you. The witness statements that were buried. The financial records that proved Jonathan's embezzlement scheme." The powder room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Diane could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, drowning out the distant sounds of wedding preparation. Why are you telling me this now?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Because 3 years ago, I watched them destroy an innocent woman, and I was too scared to speak up. Too worried about my job, my career, my comfortable life." She pulled out her phone, hands shaking. "But last month, I saw Jonathan at the firm. He was laughing with my boss about something, and I heard him say your name. He said watching you fall was better than any business deal he'd ever closed." Diane felt the familiar burn of rage in her chest, but this time it was different. This time, it came with hope. "I started digging deeper into the files," Emily continued. "I have everything, Mrs. Worthington. Bank records showing Jonathan moving money through shell companies. Emails between him and the investors he defrauded. Audio recordings of him coaching witnesses to lie about your involvement." The phone in Emily's hand contained a digital folder labeled Justice for Diane. Screenshots, audio files, video depositions. 3 years' worth of evidence that could not only clear Diane's name but expose Jonathan as the criminal he truly was. "There's more," Emily whispered, glancing toward the door. "The homeless shelter Jonathan donated to last year? The one that got all the media coverage for his supposed philanthropy." She swiped to another file. "He bought the building through a shell company first, then donated it back to himself for the tax write-off. The shelter was closed 6 months later and turned into luxury condos." Each revelation felt like a physical blow. Diane thought of all the nights she'd spent in doorways, all the meals she'd skipped, all the time she'd questioned her own memory of events. Meanwhile, Jonathan had been building his reputation on the foundation of her destruction. "Why the wedding invitation?" Diane asked, her voice hoarse. "What's his endgame?" Emily's face darkened. "He's planning to announce a new charitable foundation tonight. The Second Chances Initiative, for helping formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society." She paused, letting the irony sink in. "He wanted you here as his example of redemption through his generosity. He was going to publicly offer you a job as a janitor at one of his companies. Make this grand gesture of forgiveness for the cameras. The cruelty was breathtaking. Even Jonathan's invitation had been designed to humiliate her one final time, to position himself as the magnanimous billionaire graciously helping his criminal ex-wife. "But Emily," Diane said slowly, pieces clicking into place, "if you work for Morrison and Associates, and you have all this evidence, why haven't you gone to the authorities?" Emily's composure finally cracked. "Because 3 years ago, I was just Emily Patterson, paralegal. But now—" She held up her left hand, revealing an engagement ring that could have funded a small country. "Now I'm Emily Patterson, engaged to Victoria's brother. I'm about to become family to the people who could destroy my entire life with a phone call." The complexity of the situation hit Diane like a freight train. This young woman had risked everything, her career, her relationship, her future, to bring her the truth. But she was also trapped in the same web of wealth and power that had destroyed Diane 3 years ago. "There's something else," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "The reason Jonathan really divorced you. It wasn't just about the embezzlement you discovered." She pulled up one final file. "It was because you were getting too close to something much bigger. A human trafficking operation disguised as his international development projects." The world tilted. Diane gripped the counter harder, her vision blurring. Human trafficking? Young women from developing countries, promised jobs in America through his charitable foundations. Instead, Emily couldn't finish the sentence. "The FBI has been investigating for 2 years, but they haven't been able to make anything stick. Jonathan's lawyers are too good, his connections too deep." Diane stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing not the broken homeless woman she'd become, but the investigative journalist she'd been in college, the woman who'd never backed down from a fight for justice. The woman Jonathan had systematically tried to erase. "Emily," she said quietly, "I need you to send me everything. Every file, every recording, every piece of evidence." "What are you going to do?" For the first time in 3 years, Diane smiled, really smiled. "I'm going to give Jonathan exactly what he asked for. I'm going to make his wedding unforgettable." As Emily transferred the files to Diane's broken phone, the device buzzing with each new piece of evidence, Diane felt something she hadn't experienced since that last night in their penthouse: power. Not the kind that came from money or status, but the kind that came from truth. The powder room door opened, and Victoria Hamilton stepped in, radiant in her pre-wedding glow. Her eyes widened when she saw Diane, taking in the homeless woman's appearance with barely concealed disgust. "Oh," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I didn't realize we had unexpected guests using the family facilities." Emily quickly pocketed her phone, but not before Victoria noticed the exchange. The bride's perfect smile faltered slightly as she looked between them, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite grasp. "Actually," Diane said, standing to her full height and meeting Victoria's gaze directly, "I think you'll find this conversation was exactly what this family needed to hear." The battle lines were drawn. In less than an hour, the wedding would begin, and Jonathan would finally face the consequences of destroying the woman who'd once loved him enough to risk everything for the truth. But first, Diane had a phone call to make. The silence that followed Diane's revelation stretched like a taut wire across the Worthington Estates manicured gardens. 200 of Beverly Hills' most influential people stood frozen, champagne flutes forgotten in their hands, as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Victoria Hamilton, soon-to-be Worthington, stood at the altar in her $50,000 Vera Wang gown, her face a mask of confusion and growing horror. The woman she'd been told was Jonathan's crazy, vindictive ex-wife had just presented evidence that painted her fiancé as a criminal. And worse, Victoria was beginning to remember conversations, late-night phone calls, and mysterious meetings that suddenly made terrible sense. "This is ridiculous," Jonathan sputtered, his face flushed red above his platinum cufflinks. "She's clearly disturbed. Security should have." "Mr. Worthington." The voice cut through his protestations like a blade. Detective Maria Santos stepped forward from where she'd been positioned discreetly near the rose arbor, her LAPD badge gleaming in the California sun. "I think we need to have a conversation." Diane's knees nearly gave out. The detective, the same woman who'd been investigating Jonathan's company for months, who'd been the mysterious ally sending those text messages. Maria had been building a case, waiting for the right moment, and Diane's public revelation had just provided the opening she needed. But it was Victoria who surprised everyone the most. The bride stepped down from the altar, her silk train rustling against the stone steps, and walked directly to Diane. Up close, Victoria was even more beautiful than the society photos suggested, but there was an intelligence in her green eyes that Diane hadn't expected, a sharpness that spoke of substance beneath the perfection. "Ms. Washington," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the stunned guests. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," Diane replied, exhaustion creeping into her voice. The adrenaline that had carried her through her public declaration was fading, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable in her borrowed dress. Victoria shook her head. "Yes, I do. Jonathan told me you were unstable, that you'd made false accusations when your marriage ended. He said you were dangerous." She glanced back at her groom, who was now conferring frantically with his lawyers. "But looking at the evidence you've presented, and remembering things he said, things that didn't quite add up." "Victoria, darling, don't listen to her," Jonathan called out, his voice taking on the honeyed tone Diane remembered from their early days together. "She's clearly had some kind of breakdown. Look at her. Look at me." Diane's voice rose, and for the first time all day, she felt the fire that had once made her a force in the business world. "Look at me and see what your cruelty does to people, Jonathan. Look at me and remember that I used to love you, that I believed in you, that I would have died for you." Mrs. Eleanor Worthington, Jonathan's mother, stepped forward from the front row. At 75, she was still formidable, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her Chanel suit immaculate. But her face held something Diane had never seen there before: shame. "Diane," the older woman said, her cultured voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true? All of it?" The question hung in the air like incense. Diane looked at this woman who had once been like a mother to her, who had welcomed her into the family with warmth that now seemed like a lifetime ago. Eleanor had cut all contact when the divorce and accusations happened, choosing her son without question. But now, "Mrs. Worthington," Diane said, her voice gentle despite everything, "I never wanted to hurt your family. I just wanted justice." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. "Oh, my dear girl. What have we done to you?" The older woman moved toward Diane, and suddenly the artificial barriers of class and circumstance seemed to dissolve. Eleanor pulled Diane into an embrace that smelled of Chanel No. 5 and regret, and for a moment, Diane allowed herself to feel the maternal comfort she'd been denied for 3 years. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered. "I should have listened. I should have asked questions. I failed you, and I failed my son by enabling this." Victoria watched this exchange with growing certainty. She turned to face the wedding guests, many of whom she'd known since childhood. "I think," she announced clearly, "this wedding is over." She began removing her engagement ring, a 10-carat diamond that had graced the cover of Town and Country, and held it out toward Jonathan. "Victoria, wait," Jonathan pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice as he saw his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "You can't believe her over me. I love you. Do you?" Victoria asked, her voice steady. Or do you love the idea of me? The way I look on your arm, the way I complete your perfect life. She glanced at Diane, then back at her almost husband. Because if this is how you treat someone you once claimed to love, how can I trust that you won't do the same to me when I become inconvenient? The ring fell to the ground between them, the diamond catching the afternoon sun like a falling star. Have you ever had to choose between love and what's right? Sometimes the hardest thing is standing up to someone you care about. What would you have done in Victoria's position? Share your thoughts below. Diane watched this young woman, this stranger who had every reason to hate her, make the choice to walk away from everything society told her she should want. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The shame that had been her constant companion began to transform into something else: pride. Not in her suffering, but in her survival. Not in her poverty, but in her persistence. Detective Santos approached the small group. Ms. Washington, we'll need you to come to the station to give a full statement. And Mr. Worthington, she turned to Jonathan, who was staring at his abandoned engagement ring, you're going to want to call your lawyer. The real one this time. As chaos erupted around them, guests whispering frantically, photographers appearing from nowhere, Jonathan's security team looking thoroughly confused about their next move, Diane felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The crystal chandelier above seemed to tremble as Diane stood in the center of the Worthington Estates grand ballroom, every eye in Beverly Hills high society fixed upon her. The wedding that was supposed to cement Jonathan's triumph had become his reckoning. Ladies and gentlemen, Diane's voice carried across the marble floors with a clarity that surprised even her. 3 years of sleeping in doorways hadn't broken her. It had forged her into something unbreakable. I believe you all deserve to know exactly who you're celebrating today. Jonathan's face had drained of all color. He stepped forward, his perfectly tailored Armani tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume. Diane, you need to leave. Now. Security. Will stay exactly where they are, came a commanding voice from the crowd. District Attorney Margaret Chen stepped forward, her badge gleaming in the afternoon light streaming through the estate's floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind her, 2 FBI agents flanked the entrance. Mr. Worthington, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The gasps that rippled through the crowd sounded like breaking glass. Victoria, still in her $50,000 Vera Wang gown, stumbled backward into her father's arms. What's happening? Jonathan, what is she talking about? Diane reached into the designer purse that had materialized in her hands, a gift from someone who'd believed in justice when she'd lost faith in it herself. She pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. 3 years ago, my ex-husband framed me for crimes he committed. He stole $12 million from affordable housing funds meant for families in Detroit, Chicago, and right here in Los Angeles. Money that was supposed to build homes for people like what I became. You're lying. Jonathan's composure finally cracked, his voice rising to a pitch that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. You're a homeless drunk who's lost her mind. Nobody here believes. The Swiss bank account records say otherwise. Marcus Thompson stepped forward, Diane's former business partner and the man who'd spent 3 years gathering the evidence that would clear her name. He looked distinguished in his navy suit, every inch the successful businessman he'd become. Account number 847392156, Cayman National Trust. $12.3 million, deposited in increments to avoid federal reporting requirements. The crowd began to murmur, a low rumble that grew louder as understanding dawned on face after face. These weren't just wealthy party guests. These were people who donated to Jonathan's charity work, investors who trusted him with their money, socialites who'd celebrated his philanthropy. The FBI has been building this case for 2 years, Chen announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. Ms. Washington has been working undercover as a federal informant, gathering evidence of Mr. Worthington's criminal enterprise. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Diane wasn't homeless. She was an agent of justice. The torn coat, the cracked phone, the nights spent in doorways. It had all been real, but it had also been purposeful. She'd lived the consequences of his crimes to understand them completely, to gather evidence from the streets up. The invitation wasn't cruelty, Diane said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. It was a confession. Jonathan couldn't resist one final act of hubris, inviting his victim to witness his victory. But hubris, as the Greeks knew, always comes before the fall. Victoria's bouquet of white roses hit the floor, petals scattering across marble that probably cost more than most people's homes. "You used me," she whispered, staring at Jonathan with dawning horror. "This whole engagement, this wedding, was I just part of your cover?" Jonathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Around him, his groomsmen were backing away, investment partners were whispering urgently into their phones, and society matrons were calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from the scandal. "The beautiful thing about justice," Diane continued, "is that it doesn't care about your net worth. It doesn't care about your social status or your family name. It cares about truth." FBI agent Rivera stepped forward with handcuffs. "Jonathan Blake Worthington III, you have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights echoed through the ballroom, Diane felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: completeness. Not revenge. That would have been bitter and hollow. This was justice, clean and pure and final. Marcus approached her carefully, as if she might disappear like a mirage. "Diane, I'm so sorry. For not believing you initially, for letting you go through this alone." "I wasn't alone," she interrupted, her eyes finding Di-Chun across the room. "I had people who believed in something bigger than themselves. People who understood that sometimes you have to walk through hell to reach the truth." The handcuffs clicked shut around Jonathan's wrists. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of prison or public humiliation, fear of a woman he'd underestimated so completely that it had destroyed him. "How?" he whispered as Agent Rivera began to lead him away. "How did you survive? How did you become this?" Diane smoothed her designer dress, a gift from the Justice Department for this final performance, and smiled. "I learned the difference between being broken and being broken open. You broke me apart, Jonathan. But I chose how to put the pieces back together." The wedding guests watched in stunned silence as Jonathan was led away, his $10,000 Italian leather shoes clicking against marble for the last time as a free man. Victoria stood frozen in the center of it all, her fairy tale wedding dress now a monument to self-deception. Outside, Los Angeles stretched toward the Pacific, a city of dreams where justice had finally caught up with a man who thought himself untouchable. The afternoon sun blazed through the estate's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward a future none of them had imagined when they'd awakened that morning. Have you ever seen someone's arrogance lead to their downfall? What do you think drives people to underestimate others so completely? Share your thoughts below. The explosion was complete. Now came the aftermath, and Diane's choice of what to build from the ruins. The silence that followed Diane's revelation stretched like a taut wire across the Worthington estate's manicured gardens. 200 of Beverly Hills elites sat frozen in their Chiavari chairs, their champagne flutes forgotten, their perfectly composed faces slack with shock. Jonathan stood at the altar like a man witnessing his own execution. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo, which had cost more than most people's cars, suddenly felt like a costume, a pathetic disguise that couldn't hide what he truly was. The color had drained from his face, leaving him ashen against the backdrop of white roses and baby's breath. "That's "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. The tremor in his hands gave him away. Victoria, still clutching her bouquet of white peonies, stared between her fiancé and his ex-wife. The woman she'd been prepared to dismiss as a desperate homeless intruder had just revealed herself to be the CEO and founder of Phoenix Rising, the nonprofit that had revolutionized affordable housing across 3 states. The same organization that had been featured on the cover of Time magazine just last month. "Is it impossible, Jonathan?" Diane asked, her voice steady and clear. She no longer looked like the broken woman who'd arrived an hour ago. The dirt and desperation had been strategic theater, but now she stood tall in her simple black dress, not designer, but dignified. "Is it impossible that the woman you tried to destroy spent 3 years building something beautiful from the ashes you left her in?" Margaret Worthington, Jonathan's steel magnolia mother, gripped her pearl necklace so tightly the strand threatened to snap. She'd never approved of Jonathan's first marriage, had made that clear in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways. But this was beyond her worst nightmares. "Jonathan," she hissed through clenched teeth, "what is she talking about?" The guests murmured among themselves, smartphones appearing as the more tech-savvy began Googling Phoenix Rising and Diane Washington. The results painted a picture that made Jonathan's crimes impossible to ignore. A woman who'd taken a $500 loan and built an empire of hope, whose organization had housed over 10,000 families, whose TED Talk on resilience had been viewed 15 million times. District Attorney Patricia Chun, who'd been invited as a family friend, slowly rose from her seat. She'd prosecuted the fraud case against Diane 3 years ago, a case that had never sat right with her, despite the evidence that seemed ironclad at the time. "Mrs. Washington," Chun said carefully, "are you saying that evidence was fabricated in your case?" Diane reached into her purse, a simple leather bag that looked humble but had been crafted by the finest artisans in Florence, and withdrew a tablet. "I'm saying that truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it." She touched the screen, and suddenly the estate sound system, hijacked by her tech team, filled with audio recordings. Jonathan's voice, 3 years younger but just as arrogant, echoing across the stunned wedding party. "She'll never be able to prove anything. Who's going to believe a drunk black woman over me? I've got judges in my pocket, witnesses on my payroll. By the time I'm done with her, she'll be lucky if she can get a job cleaning toilets." Victoria's bouquet hit the ground with a soft thud. White petals scattered across the marble like fallen snow. "Have you ever had to choose between revenge and taking the high road when someone wronged you? What did you choose and why? Share your story in the comments below." Jonathan lunged toward the sound booth, but 2 men in dark suits, FBI agents who'd been waiting in the wings, stepped into his path. Agent Rodriguez held up his badge with one hand and a warrant with the other. "Jonathan Blake Worthington III, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and perjury. You have the right to remain silent." But Jonathan wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Diane, and in them she saw something she'd never expected to see: genuine fear. Not of prison or public disgrace, but of her. Of what she'd become despite his best efforts to destroy her. "How?" he whispered as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "How did you survive it?" Diane walked toward him slowly, her heels clicking against marble that had once intimidated her but now felt like conquered territory. The guests parted before her like the Red Sea, their judgment replaced by something approaching awe. She stopped just inches from his face, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to smell the expensive cologne that couldn't mask the scent of his desperation. "You want to know how I survived?" she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the amplified silence. "Every morning when I woke up in that shelter on Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, I had a choice. I could let your poison kill me, or I could use it to build something stronger than your hatred." She paused, letting her words sink in not just to Jonathan, but to everyone watching. You taught me that the system is rigged, Jonathan. So I changed the system. You showed me that money talks, so I learned to make money talk for people who'd never had a voice. You proved that one person with power can destroy lives, so I became the person with power who rebuilds them. Jonathan's composure finally cracked completely. I had everything, he screamed, his voice breaking like a child's. You were supposed to stay broken. You were supposed to disappear. I did disappear, Diane replied calmly. The woman you knew, the one who needed your approval, who believed your lies about her worth, she died in that alley behind Chase Bank. But someone better was born from her ashes. Victoria finally found her voice. The housing project in Riverside, she said numbly. The one that won the humanitarian award last year. That was you. Diane nodded. 1,500 units. All for families who lost their homes to predatory lending schemes. Schemes like the ones your fiancé used to run. Ex-fiancé, Victoria corrected quietly, sliding the 10-carat diamond ring from her finger. It fell to the marble with a small final sound. As the agents led Jonathan away, he turned back one last time. This isn't over, Diane. I'll fight this. No, Jonathan, she interrupted. It is over. But not because I destroyed you. You destroyed yourself the moment you chose cruelty over love, revenge over redemption. I just made sure the world could see what was already there. The crowd began to disperse, some guests hurrying away in embarrassment, others approaching Diane with apologies and business cards. Margaret Worthington sat alone in the front row, staring at the altar where her son's dreams of dynasty had crumbled into dust. But Diane barely noticed any of it. Her attention was focused on a figure at the back of the garden, a tall man in a simple navy suit who'd been watching everything unfold with quiet intensity. As their eyes met across the chaos, he began walking toward her. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the trauma surgeon who'd treated her in the ER after her third suicide attempt, who'd held her hand while she cried about losing everything, who'd believed in her recovery when she couldn't believe in anything at all. The man who'd become first her doctor, then her friend, then her foundation's biggest supporter, and finally, just 3 months ago, something more. He'd been the one to suggest this dramatic revelation, to turn Jonathan's cruelty into a moment of triumph not just for her, but for everyone who'd ever been told they were worthless. How do you feel? Marcus asked when he reached her, his surgeon's hands gentle as they touched her face. Diane looked around at the destruction of her former life, the scattered rose petals, the overturned chairs, the guests fleeing like roaches from light. She thought of the homeless woman she'd pretended to be, the billionaire who tried to humiliate her, and the truth that had finally set them all free. Free, she whispered. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free. 6 months later, the autumn sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Diane's corner office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building. The nameplate on her mahogany desk read Diane Washington, CEO Second Chances Foundation, and behind her, the New York City skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to dreams rebuilt and justice served. She stood at the window, her reflection showing a woman transformed, not just by the Armani suit that fit her perfectly restored figure, or the natural hair that now framed her face in elegant coils, but by the quiet confidence that radiated from within. The woman who had once cowered in doorways was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that true strength comes not from never falling, but from rising with grace. The final settlement papers just came through, said Marcus Chin, her attorney and the man who had sent that mysterious text message 6 months ago. He entered her office carrying a thick manila folder, his smile warm with satisfaction. Jonathan will be serving 8 to 12 years for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The SEC seized his remaining assets yesterday. Diane turned from the window, her expression serene. And Victoria? Free and clear. The prenup protected her from his crimes, and she's already filed for annulment. Apparently, she's been quietly volunteering at women's shelters since the wedding. Marcus paused, studying Diane's face. She asked me to give you this. He handed her an envelope, simple white paper, nothing like the golden invitation that had started this journey. Inside was a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. Diane, I've spent 6 months thinking about what you said at the wedding. That love should lift us up, not tear us down. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. I hope someday I can be half as brave as you were that day. With admiration and respect, Victoria. Diane folded the note carefully, a small smile playing at her lips. She's going to be fine. She has a good heart. She was just caught up in Jonathan's web like the rest of us. Have you ever had to completely rebuild your life from scratch? What gave you the strength to keep going? Share your story of resilience in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. Marcus moved to the window beside her, both of them looking out at the city that had witnessed Diane's fall and miraculous rise. I still can't believe how perfectly it all came together. When I saw you on that park bench 3 years ago, trying to research legal aid attorneys on that cracked phone, I knew I had to help somehow. But I never imagined it would lead to this. The memory was still vivid, Marcus discovering Diane sleeping rough in Washington Square Park, recognizing her from the business magazines where he'd first read about Jonathan's company. As a former prosecutor who had been quietly investigating Worthington Industries for years, he'd seen the suspicious pattern of destroyed evidence and intimidated witnesses. But he'd needed someone with inside knowledge to help him build a case. You took an incredible risk, Diane said, watching a young couple walk hand in hand through the park below. Spending 2 years gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the right moment. The risk was worth it. Besides, Marcus's voice softened, it wasn't just about justice anymore. Somewhere along the way, watching you rebuild yourself with such dignity, I realized I was fighting for more than just legal victory. Diane felt her cheeks warm, the familiar flutter in her chest that had been growing stronger each day. Marcus had been more than her attorney. He'd been her anchor, her champion, and slowly, carefully, something deeper. Where Jonathan had demanded she diminish herself to make him feel powerful, Marcus celebrated her strength and encouraged her to shine brighter. The foundation is fully operational, she said, deflecting the intensity of the moment with professional talk. We've already helped 63 women transition out of homelessness and back into the workforce. The tech training program in partnership with Hamilton Industries is exceeding all expectations. Victoria's father really came through on that partnership, Marcus observed. Guilt is a powerful motivator, Diane replied. He realized his daughter almost married a monster, and he wants to make amends. Sometimes good can come from the darkest places. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the therapist who had helped her process 3 years of trauma and discover the woman she was meant to become. Saw the Wall Street Journal article about the foundation. So proud of how far you've come. Remember our conversation about being open to love again? Winking face. Diane smiled, glancing at Marcus, who was pretending to read legal documents while stealing glances at her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd had to lose everything to discover what truly mattered. Jonathan's attempt to humiliate her had instead revealed her unbreakable spirit to the world, launched a foundation that was changing lives, and brought her face to face with a love that was patient, kind, and real. There's something I need to tell you, Marcus said, setting down his papers and turning to face her fully. The partnership with Chen and Associates? I'm thinking of making some changes. What kind of changes? Diane asked, though her heart was already racing. The kind where I focus less on corporate law and more on pro bono work. Maybe even join the foundation full-time. He stepped closer, his dark eyes serious but warm. I've been thinking about what matters most, about where I want to spend my energy, about who I want to spend my life with." The words hung between them, electric with possibility. Diane had learned to trust her instincts again, and every instinct told her that Marcus Chun was nothing like the man who had tried to break her. Where Jonathan had been possessive, Marcus was supportive. Where Jonathan had been controlling, Marcus was encouraging. Where Jonathan had seen her race as something to be ashamed of, Marcus celebrated her heritage and her strength. "Marcus," she began, but he gently took her hands. "I know we've been taking it slow, and I respect that. You needed time to heal, to rebuild, to remember who you are. But Diane, watching you transform these past months, not just externally, but seeing you reclaim your power, your joy, your incredible capacity for love, has been the privilege of my lifetime." Through the window, the first stars were becoming visible against the darkening sky. The city lights twinkled below them like possibilities waiting to be explored. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because I want to rescue you, you've already rescued yourself. Not because I want to complete you, you're already complete. I love you because you're brilliant and strong and kind, because you see the best in people even after the worst was done to you, because you turned your pain into purpose and your suffering into service." Diane felt tears she wasn't ashamed of sliding down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could trust again, didn't think I deserved." "You deserve everything," Marcus interrupted gently. "You deserve a love that celebrates you, not one that diminishes you. You deserve a partner who stands beside you, not one who stands on you to feel taller." As he leaned down to kiss her, Diane thought about the golden invitation that had seemed like a death sentence 6 months ago. Jonathan had wanted to showcase her brokenness, but instead, he'd given her the stage to display her resilience. He'd wanted to prove she was worthless, but instead, he'd reminded her of her infinite worth. The kiss was soft, reverent, full of promises for a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "So," Marcus said, his forehead resting against hers, "what do you say we go home and plan our next adventure?" "Our next adventure?" Diane laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "Well, the foundation needs an office in Los Angeles. Something about expanding to help women on the West Coast. I hear Beverly Hills has some beautiful venues for fundraising galas." Diane threw her head back and laughed, the same laugh that had once filled boardrooms in Jonathan's penthouse, but now it was deeper, truer, earned through fire and refined by grace. "You know what?" she said, gathering her purse and coat. "I think it's time to show Beverly Hills what real power looks like." As they walked toward the elevator, arm in arm, Diane caught sight of her reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at her was radiant, not because of her success or her beautiful clothes or even her newfound love, but because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that her worth had never been dependent on anyone else's approval, and her happiness had always been her own to claim. The elevator doors opened, and together they stepped into their future, a future where love lifted them both higher, where second chances led to first choices, and where the woman who had once been discarded like trash had become the architect of her own destiny. In Beverly Hills, Jonathan Worthington sat in a federal holding cell, finally understanding that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars, and real power couldn't be bought or stolen. It could only be earned through character, kindness, and the courage to love again. And in New York City, as autumn painted the sky in shades of gold and possibility, Diane Washington Chun, for that would be her name soon enough, had found her happily ever after, not in being rescued by a man, but in rescuing herself and having the wisdom to recognize real love when it finally beautifully arrived. Sometimes our greatest humiliations become our most powerful transformations. How did Diane's journey from the streets of Manhattan to the heights of success inspire you? What would you want to tell her if you could?
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing as you can never imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.